As per the introduction, my name is Leslie Mabon, and I'm from the Scottish Association for Marine Science in the west of Scotland. A couple of things I'll just sort of say before we start. One being, I know this is not a chat function, but my English may be a little unfamiliar to some of you, so I will try to speak slowly and clearly, but if I do start going too fast, don't hesitate to cut in, and I'll slow down. Second thing I will say as well is I appreciate it's a big day where you all are, regardless of affiliation. From our side of the Atlantic as well, we've had a lot of such events recently. So if you feel the need to check on Twitter or see what Nate Silver's saying or check on the New York Times or whatever, I won't be offended at all. You know, you have my sympathy. I know what it's like. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Having said that, we're going to be talking about something completely different today. And this is about environmental change on the coast of Fukushima in Japan. And before I start, I wanted to acknowledge that this is not work that I do alone. It's work that's been possible thanks to collaboration with a number of institutions, organizations, and indeed individuals, particularly in Japan. And I want to single out in particular Midori Kawabe from Tokyo University of Marine Science and Technology, who's been a very good collaborator of mine for exactly 8 years. It was exactly in November 2012 that I first met her, and I was introduced to fishers in Fukushima, and we've been working ever since, and also in partnership with a number of governmental and non-governmental organizations within Fukushima itself. So before I kind of get into explaining about the history and context, I had to do a lot of updating in between when I prepared an abstract for this talk and when I planned what I was going to say. And the key issue we're going to talk about today, and which I'm going to reflect on, is what's happening now on the coast of northeast Japan. Because at the end of last month, it was decided, and I'll get into the kind of science and the technology of this later, essentially that not inconsiderable quantities of water containing radioactive substances were going to be released from the Fukushima nuclear site into the Pacific Ocean. So this is the Fukushima plant as it looks today. And you can see maybe around the edges there, there's all these blue tanks, which if you look as well from satellite view, you can see these fill up the entire land around the site of the Fukushima nuclear plant. And all of these are filled with water that is essentially has been pumped through the damaged reactors to keep them cooler, has been recovered from the ground. All of this contains contaminants. They're running out of space, and essentially it needs to be released into the sea. And this is proving to be highly controversial. There's significant opposition from non-governmental organizations, in particular from local fisheries cooperatives. And I say I'm going to get more into the kind of background and context in a minute, but that's a kind of overarching point that I want to make and take away today, is that the way in which we think about these releases of treated waters, it's not only an issue of technical safety and risk communication, but rather we're talking about an issue here that has a potential to jeopardize an entire livelihood and sense of identity for fishers and for coastal communities, regardless of the actual harm it may pose to humans. So that's where we're kind of coming from, and that's the context that this is being set against. And also, and I make no apology for doing this, we've had a paper that's just come out in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, the more conceptual basis of what I'm going to talk about around resilience at community and local level, we discuss and explore in this paper. And one thing I'm especially pleased about with this publication, you'll notice we have quite an extensive author list for the social sciences. Half of these authors are extension officers from the regional government in Fukushima who worked with us on this and worked with us on the interviewing fishers and doing the data analysis. And we're very happy that we were able to have them on board as co-authors and then hopefully co-producing this knowledge. So again, I just wanted to acknowledge that, again, this is not work that is entirely my own, but rather is the result of a large team of people. So I'll rewind and I'll give a bit of context, a bit of background context to what I just spoke about, which will then lead back into this issue. We'll come back to this issue of treated water, but I'm going to delve into the history and context now to explain a bit about why that's significant and why that matters. So Fukushima as an administrative district is in the northeast of Japan, about 250 kilometers northeast of Tokyo. And as you'll probably be aware, on March the 11th, 2011, the whole of the northeast seaboard of Japan was struck by a very large earthquake, which triggered a tsunami, which has stretched up to 40 meters in height at its highest point and reached 10 kilometers inland. And that alone killed over 15,000 people. And I think that's always, worth remembering, that regardless of the radiation situation, that this is a very, very deadly tsunami. One of the things it did, however, was it knocked out cooling systems at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, which was on the coast of Fukushima region. And this triggered a series of hydrogen explosions, which led to the release of radioactive material over the land and the sea of Fukushima. I always have this map, and I apologize for the Japanese characters, but the reason I always have this map is that I think it's important to acknowledge when we use the word Fukushima, what is it that we're actually talking about? And so Fukushima as an administrative district is quite big. I don't know how this analogy is going to translate to a largely US-based audience, but it's about half the size of Belgium. So in Europe, we put everything in terms of the number of sizes of Belgium. But Fukushima is quite big. It's a large administrative area, covers probably a width of, again, several hundred kilometers. So we're not talking about a small geographical unit here. And yet, this entire area comes to be associated with radioactivity and with the nuclear accident by virtue of the name association with the nuclear power plant. And when one gets into issues of stigmatization, that's quite significant. Nonetheless, on land, the nuclear accident had a not insignificant effect, and it's still the case that there are over 100,000 people who are not able to return home. And these maps show you some of the areas immediately around the plant. And there are areas where it's no exaggeration to say that people will never be living again during our lifetimes. Nonetheless, the most significant part of this was that 70 to 80% of contamination ended up in the Northwest Pacific Ocean, from airborne fallout, from hydrogen explosions, from leaks of highly contaminated water, and also from releases of less tainted substances after. The result of this being that over 40% of fish that were sampled exceeded the Japanese regulatory threshold for radioactive cesium. Over time, that contamination is declining as we learn, as it's diluted, and as we learn more about how radiation moves through the environment, we have a better understanding. But as I'm going to come back to, there is this continuing concern over leaks into groundwater. So Fukushima, as with much of Japan, economically, socially, culturally, politically, fishing is very important. And because of these, the releases of radioactivity into the sea, coastal fishing in Fukushima is still officially restricted. Since 2012, so since a year following the disaster, fishing has resumed on the Fukushima coast on a trial basis, very small scale operations, about 10 to 20% of the levels they were before disaster. And that progresses on a case-by-case basis. Different species, different ports are allowed to resume trial operations if radioactive cesium is not detected within the produce in routine monitoring, where it can then be sold to brokers and on to consumers. And there are plans to upscale some fishing districts and some of these activities to about 60%, or just over half of pre-disaster levels by 2024. So again, it's worth remembering the Fukushima nuclear accident was, I believe, the largest ever accidental marine contamination incident ever in the world, because it has had and continues to have significant effect on coastal fishing communities within the Fukushima region. So this is what this is, and I'm going to apologize again. There are quite a few things that I will illustrate that are written entirely in Japanese, but I'll talk you through what they are. So this is a list of all the, from the start of this year, of all the different species that have been released from restrictions for consumption. And this is released by the regional governor. There's his little photo in the bottom right and his signature. And this is Uchibori-san, the regional governor, saying these fish species are safe for consumption and we encourage you to eat them. And then this list is updated periodically. But as I kind of alluded to at the start, and this is what I really want to talk about, is that revitalization of fisheries, revitalization of the coastal landscape is closely linked to the sort of rehabilitation and post-disaster recovery of coastal society more widely in Fukushima. And again, as I'm going to come back to later, anything such as the releases of treated water that has a potential to jeopardize this, therefore, is of significant concern locally. So keeping kind of in within the sort of theme of the different talks, something I've been getting very interested in recently has been about this idea of resilience. And resilience is something that, depending on the disciplinary field one belongs to, can mean very different things. And so particularly in disaster risk reduction, there's this idea of either returning to core functions following a shock or an external upset, of sort of bouncing forward. So rather than bouncing back, the acknowledgement that it might not be possible to return to a previous state and instead moving forwards to something else. And we're probably all very familiar with the rhetoric of building back better, certainly in the UK. In the context of coronavirus, we've been hearing a lot about building back better. But again, that's a terminology that has a much longer and much more contested history in disaster risk reduction studies, of how this has been picked up and used by various actors to either depoliticize events or deflect attention away from the cause of them, or indeed it sometimes masks in whose interests building back happens. So as part of the kind of later stages of our work in Fukushima, we've very recently been considering this idea of what does resilience mean on the Fukushima coast. And we've become interested in particular in a sort of subset of resilience thinking, which is particularly around inherent resilience. And so this is a way of thinking about resilience that is about the qualities that exist within communities from everyday practices that help communities to respond to and mitigate environmental hazard events. Interestingly, when I was pleased to see Emily mention the Texas coast at the start of this, because quite a lot of the conceptual work around inherent resilience actually has been done on the Gulf Coast, particularly in the context of Hurricane Katrina, in the context of Deepwater Horizon, and the ability of coastal communities to respond to or move on or not, as the case may be, from these shocks and upsets. And so it was quite interesting to see that when we started thinking about resilience in the context of Fukushima and a major coastal pollution event, there was this history, particularly, as I say, from the Gulf Coast, of thinking about how social memory carries some of these ideas of what inherent resilience practices are, how social networks are important, how informal relations are important, how sense of place, culturally meaningful practices and all the rest can help communities to continue to function or to change their form in response to these significant external pressures. And this is very true as well for Fukushima. And what's quite noticeable in the case of Fukushima is that the natural landscape of the coast and the ecosystem of the coastal region is a very important aspect of sustaining this inherent resilience and the kind of rituals and practices that are associated with it. So what we have here, for instance, this is a very small shrine on the southern coast. And this shrine is, as you might imagine, with it being next to the sea, this is linked to the safety of fishers. And so this is a shrine that is established to kind of hope for the safety of fishers who are out at sea. Interestingly as well, where I live, I grew up in a fishing village in Scotland. I live in a fishing village. We have an awful lot of churches here as well. I mean, per capita, we probably have more churches in fishing villages than anywhere else in Scotland. So there's something interesting to think about there, about the links between, again, religion and the sea and inherent practices of resilience. Also as well, so this is a ritual they have in one of the coastal communities in Naraha, where they carry this and they carry little shrines. Once a year, they carry the shrine down from the mountains down to the sea, again with the hope of bringing prosperity and bringing protection, particularly to fishers, and to thinking about linking the coast, the land and the sea. Consumption of food as well is also a big part of that, and consumption of marine produce. We've found across our various bits of data collection, across our interviews and fieldwork, that the consumption of fish and the consumption of produce grown in the coastal zone is very important as a way of interacting and facilitating relations between people. And if you look across different bits of popular culture as well, you can see that consumption of produce grown in the natural environment really becomes a sense of pride on the Fukushima coast. So on the left here, you've got a tweet, and that's the first Pacific Sauri being landed of the year. This thing in the middle as well, I'm going to say a little bit about this comic book, because this is quite interesting. So this is it's a series of comic books that were written by an author who actually worked as a labourer at the nuclear plant in the years immediately after the accident. But what he writes about, what he draws and what he talks about is not necessarily just his day-to-day work in the nuclear power station cleaning it up. Instead, he talks a lot about where he lives, the landscapes he drives through, the food he eats, and this milk drink, Rakuo Cafe au lait, which is made using a combination of milk, which is sourced from cows locally, plus sugar and cocoa powder. You can buy this everywhere. This is very specific to Fukushima, and it's a real kind of conspicuous consumption thing on social media, that people use the consumption of this to assert their identity as residents or supporters of Fukushima Prefecture. So I apologize for the slightly dull slide here, but about a year and a half ago, I started to think more and more about the coastal ecosystems and about how they are linked to understandings of resilience at a community level. And I know not everybody necessarily agrees with the framings and language and ideas of ecosystem services, but as a sort of conceptual tool, as a heuristic, we worked through all of the recovery plans that had been laid out by each of the small townships immediately round the nuclear plant, and looked at all the ways in which the sea and the coast and coastal ecosystems were seen as bringing benefits to people within the recovery of the municipalities. And what you can see quite strongly from this is that it's these cultural benefits that really come across. It's not sort of, well, the economics associated with agriculture and fisheries are mentioned, But the most significant way in which the coastal ecosystem is talked about in terms of recovery is around these social and cultural benefits, well-being, physical, mental health, sense of place, spiritual inspiration. And so again, that gave us sort of a motivation to think in more depth about, well, why is this? And what are some of the stories, what are some of the practices around how living and working in this coastal landscape becomes part of building and sustaining informal resilience strategies. Which brings me now on to I want to talk more specifically now about fisheries and about fishing, and about what inherent resilience means in the context of fishing. Before I do that, though, there's an elephant in the room, I think, that needs to be addressed, and it will become quite apparent as we go through the slides. And that is that when we see a lot of the voices, and when we hear a lot of the voices around fisheries and bouncing forwards or building back or whatever, a lot of what is very prominent are the voices of men. And partly there is a kind of pragmatic reason for that, in that the vast majority of fishers are male. But again, it's something I wanted to acknowledge, and I'll come back and reflect on it a bit later, that the voices of men are very prominent in these discourses, in the public-facing discourses as well, around the management, the governance of the recovery of fisheries. Men are extremely prominent. And as I say, I'll come back to that later, but I wanted to acknowledge that at this point. So across the last couple of years in particular, myself and Professor Kawabe have been conducting a lot of workshops with fishers and with fisheries cooperatives, with the staff on the quayside, and with indeed the extension, the engagement officers in the local government who work to connect the fishers with the underpinning science. And I'm just going to pick out a few of the quite maybe interesting and slightly surprising stories that we've learned. Because especially quite recently, we've started asking fishers not so much about how they think about the technical risks of radiation, but rather how they feel about their livelihoods more broadly. And something that we heard at the end of last year, which neither us nor the regional government officers had heard before, was that the more senior fishers had said, okay, it's great that we're able to go back out fishing on a trial basis, but we feel that we're losing something. And particularly older trawler captains had said, when we do the trial operations, we only go out in good weather. You know, we don't go out if there's a storm. And the result of that is that they feel that we can't teach the younger generations, and in particular our sons, how to fish in storms. And that was, particularly for the more senior fishers, that was seen as quite a significant loss, because for them, for their fishing district, Soma, in the north of Fukushima, being able to go out and fish in storms, that was part of their sense of who they were. It was something that they were very proud of. Historically, they had that marker that the Soma trawlermen, and I say men because as previously they are nearly all men, they would go out in any weather. No matter how bad the weather was, they could go out and they could return a catch, they could land a catch. And the more senior fishers felt that, you know, this informal opportunity to pass this knowledge down of the marine environment in bad weather to their sons was something that they were lacking because of the restrictions that continued to be imposed. And there's also an issue around the loss of regular fishing leading to a loss of opportunities for interaction with other fishers and with their friends. And so we heard lots and lots of narratives, not just from fishers, but also from workers on the ports and the fish markets, about how when boats came in, you know, everybody would go down, everybody would help to unload the fish. That's when people would talk. They would talk to each other, they would check in on each other, they would hear each other's stories. And that was an important source of mutual support within a lot of these coastal communities. And so whilst the residents of a lot of the fishing ports were really happy that, at least at a trial basis, that they were able to start fishing again, the fact that this didn't happen at such an extensive scale meant that many of these opportunities for interaction were lost. Just to illustrate this as well, to illustrate some of that informality and the importance of informality, this is a photograph that I took in 2014. And I didn't realize this at the time. I was just taking it as a generic illustration of what the trial fish markets looked like. But what I realized after is if we see on the right of the screen here, we have a practical joke going on. We've got one fisher here giving another one a Japanese wedgie, which is a bizarre thing to see, but it says a lot about fishing, and fishers, certainly in the UK as well and in Japan, are very closed and usually very hostile to interaction with outsiders. However, the gentleman there in the light-coloured shirt, he's from the local government, and he's managed to build quite a good rapport with the fishers, to the extent that these kind of informal practices can re-emerge. So, the quayside, the fish markets for the fishers to an extent are a safe space where they can have these interactions on an informal basis without feeling the pressure of being observed from above. And so again, the loss of these instances of informal interaction is quite significant when we think about what contributes to maintaining inherent resilience. And lastly as well, and I said there was the gender aspect too, because one thing that came across as well was fishers, and indeed the women's division within the fisheries cooperatives, talking about changes in family relations following the suspension of fisheries. So when fishers fish normally, they start at 1 in the morning. They get up at 1 in the morning, they go out in their boats, and they're out for most of the day, or sometimes they're out for 2 and 3 days. Trial operations start later, finish earlier, happen once or twice a week. The result of this is that particularly male members of households are at home more. They're spending more time at home, less time out in the boats, which leads to changes in relations and dynamics within families. And also interestingly, and it was said to us by some of the younger fishers in jest, but there's a serious point underlying this, that some of the younger captains were saying we're getting fat. They're saying, we're putting on 5-10 kilograms in weight because they're not out in the boats every day, hauling the nets in, taking their catches in. They're not out doing hard physical work, and they're putting weight on as a result. And again, as I say, while that was said humorously, there was an underlying quite serious point there about how the stoppage of fisheries and the inability to go out and land a full-scale catch has these sort of less tangible, but nonetheless very significant effects on fishers' own embodied practices and the relations of their families. Nevertheless, though, it is the case that the fisheries are the fish markets are starting to return, and the act of being able to go out and consume and eat Fukushima fish produce again is seen as being exceedingly significant locally. So if you go out around the towns on the southern part of the Fukushima coast, you'll see these white, blue and red flags everywhere. And essentially, this is a branding campaign that's been run by the local government, which says that the shops stock locally landed produce. And so, if you go on social media, you'll see there's quite a lot of people who live locally who make a habit of going out, buying produce and conspicuously consuming it by tweeting about what they're eating, or indeed the places in which they're eating them. So this is a very famous local arcade, the Iwaki Ichiba, means the night market in one of the larger cities, Iwaki, on the southern Fukushima coast, where you can very easily find fish produce that is made with locally landed fish. And again, there's a kind of real performativity to residents going out eating here, and especially using social media to say that they've been out here and they've eaten, and that they've eaten and that they're supporting local fisheries and the resumption of local fishing. And so again, as I say, the idea of the spaces and practices of consumption are important for the wider community as part of the kind of revitalization and the recovery of local identity, both physical spaces and virtual and online spaces. So practices that are linked to the sea and the coast are important coping and recovery strategies. And I've said here Soma district, which is up in the north of Fukushima, but also in the south as well. The restrictions on fishing limit the potential for maybe passing on some of these skills for coping with extreme weather, and indeed for actually participating in fishing itself. Changes in relationships with the sea and indeed the coastal landscape affect relationships with families and peers, and the conspicuous consumption of produce more widely is a significant part of re-establishing and sustaining social relations. All of this, as I say, ties back to this idea of resilience from the ground up through informal networks and informal relations, and how re-establishing these relations has been important for residents and fishers themselves to feel that they are bouncing forwards. Another thing I wanted to raise briefly before I bring us back to present and to the tritiated water, the contaminated water, is just something about the scientific basis on which claims to the safety of Fukushima seafood are made, and about why there is so much pride locally in what has been achieved so far. And one of the reasons for this is that the process that is undertaken to bring fish back to consumers is very arduous, and it involves a whole range of processes. And so what happens in the first instance is that fish of all kinds of different varieties are caught, landed and brought ashore and are then dissected. There's a lot of slides here, but I'm going to fire through them quite quickly. A lot of them are for illustrative purposes, which are then dissected and screened by the regional government in their fancy new labs, which have been built at not an insignificant cost. If, as I said before, if radioactive cesium has not been detected in produce for a significant period of time, specific species are then released for commercial operations. So fishers will go out in their boats, they'll catch these small trial quantities, bring them to fish market. Landings from the trial operations will then be screened and monitored again. So you have this initial threshold to actually be allowed to do the commercial fishing. There's then an additional process of monitoring, which is done by the fisheries cooperatives themselves to assess what is in each batch that's landed. This is done at the quayside, at the fish markets and themselves by trained staff. Consumers can then go online, and from at least 2 different sources, they can access data which shows the levels of radioactive cesium in the produce that they buy. And so these are updated by the fisheries cooperative weekly. And what you see here is, again, different species of fish, the date, the port they're landed in, the date the monitoring was done, and the concentrations of radioactive cesium in each. And on the right-hand column, every single one of those says not detected, so at a level where radioactive cesium cannot be detected. Similarly, the regional government in Fukushima has its own data sources, where again, one can do the same thing. You can go online, you can look at what's been screened, where it's been screened, what species, what concentrations of different radioactive substances. All this data is put out online for those who wish to access and read it. This is accompanied by a fairly extensive marketing campaign that tries to go beyond the idea of fish being safe and instead talk about fish as being delicious and worth eating due to the distinctive characteristics of the local marine environment. So these 2 arrows here, what this essentially shows is that off the coast of South Fukushima, you have a warm current and a cold current that mix. And this gives us nutrient-rich waters, which lead to large-sized, healthy, and delicious fish. One can also notice, again, a lot of men, but more specifically, a lot of people who are involved in the fishing operations themselves, their faces are very visible in these campaigns. The blue and white and red flags, as I've talked about, make a lot of appearances too. The idea being just kind of illustrate and create the impression that these are locally caught, locally sourced fish, whereby revitalization is happening in the interest and for the benefit of the local community. You go into fish shops, fish markets, and stuff that's been landed through trial operations is quite clearly marked. So these are clams. These are clams that have been landed off the Fukushima coast that you can go in and buy fresh. And there are also citizen-led monitoring efforts as well, which take place independent of anything that's considered to be linked to the government. So there's an NGO who goes out and they charter a vessel and they go out fishing very close to the nuclear plant, just a couple of kilometers offshore. They catch fish in collaboration with the local aquarium. They do their own monitoring and screening, which members of the public can attend, can view the process and understand the grounds on which claims to the safety or otherwise of marine produce in Fukushima are made. The idea being to show transparency in process and also to provide a source of data that is perceived as being somehow independent or separate or neutral from the government or fisheries cooperatives who might be perceived as having a vested interest in the restart of the fisheries. And again, one of the things that comes across quite strongly on this is not just the techno-scientific safety, but about a sense of pride in the quality of the marine produce that is landed from the seas off the coast of Fukushima. So these was an event. I went to a tasting event and they were showing people how to cook octopus. It was certainly quite educational for me, being from a part of the world where we don't normally consume such things. However, this takes us up to the present. So the story I've tried to tell there is essentially in two parts. One being that there's this strong cultural significance of fisheries and of the coastal and marine ecosystem, and also about the extensive efforts that have been undertaken to both build consumer trust, but also to establish a sense that the seafood of Fukushima is valuable and is worth eating. However, this takes us up to the present day and to the fact that whilst it's 9.5 years since the Fukushima nuclear accident started, this is by no means a disaster that's finished. And so it's estimated that it will take another 40 years yet for the damaged plant to be completely decommissioned. And right by the sea here, we have a number of reactor buildings that still contain melted down fuel, substances that people can't reach yet, and reactors that have to be kept cool through the constant pumping through of water. And this doesn't mean that they're going to spectacularly explode again, but nonetheless, these are these reactors which need to be kept cool, and whereby there is byproduct of that treated water that has to be stored on site in these metal tanks that I was talking about. As you can see from the air, space is running out. One question that my students always ask, and I'll address it, is why can't you just expand the site? The problem is that surrounding area needs to be used for storing other kinds of waste, specifically contaminated soil. So there's a real space problem on land, and there's also a kind of ethical issue here about how townships that where levels of radiation are too high for people to return come to be turned into waste storage sites for the rest of the prefecture and beyond. But as I said at the start, there's an issue with space running out here, and it has been decided on the basis of expert opinion that the most appropriate course of action is to release this stored water into the sea to free up space. And there's been significant opposition to this from fishers, from fisheries cooperatives, on the grounds of reputational damage and the perception that this will lead to seafood from Fukushima again being seen as being tainted. So the current state of play is that in spring 2020, an expert committee concluded that releasing water into the sea was the best option. Technically, economically, it was the most feasible option. In October 2020, so last month, the fishers of Fukushima made a representation to the Japanese government stating their strong opposition to the plans to release treated water into the sea, but not operating alternatives. On the basis of this, the Japanese government said they supported the plan to release treated water, and the new Prime Minister, Suga, had stated he planned to act quickly to put this into effect. Nonetheless, there's still no date that's been set yet for the actual release of water into the sea, or the details on the method and process by which this is going to happen. Again, this is a photo I took in January when we attended a committee meeting in Fukushima of operators from the nuclear plant, local government, fisheries cooperatives, academic experts. And again, as I said before, it's worth thinking about the gender makeup here. So I was sitting with my PhD student who passed me a note, and she said, "I'm the only woman in this room," as she looked around her. And I think this is also notable when we think about consumption and where very legitimate concerns actually over radioactivity in food come from. So I'm maybe showing my age here a bit, but I was born a year before the Chernobyl nuclear accident in the former Soviet Union. So I was 1 year old when that happened. And because of the way the wind blew at the time, a lot of the radioactive matter was carried and deposited over the hills of northwest England and southwest Scotland, which are also in the UK, are our main sheep grazing grounds. My mother was understandably quite concerned about this, and the result of this was that I did not eat lamb until I was 17 years old. And even then, this was lamb that was imported from New Zealand. And so the reason I say this then is there's a real tendency in Fukushima around seafood to talk a lot about dispelling harmful rumours, dispelling unfounded concerns, and to providing the public and consumers with technically accurate scientific information about the safety of different strategies. Nonetheless, I think particularly there's a gender aspect to here, to where ethics of care lie, and to who is, in the Japanese context, it's often talked about particularly mothers who make purchasing and consumption decisions within households. This was the case in Scotland as well when I was growing up. And understandably, there are a lot of very legitimate concerns that people have about what is an acceptable level of risk. And so again, I think it's worth just reflecting. And I apologize, I can't say anything kind of more intelligent than this, but the fact that you have a lot of these decisions about the releases of treated water being made by a room of middle-aged to slightly more senior rooms full of men is, I think, quite interesting. And also, and again, I think there's a bit of a cultural difference as well, in that this is not spoken about as much in Japan as it might be in the UK or in Europe. Nonetheless, to kind of keep the story moving forwards, so interestingly, the science, having just said all that, Ken Busler from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute was a very respected marine chemist. He had a short piece in Science last month in which he was talking about the sort of scientific basis for concerns over radioactivity and contamination of the marine environment. And the broad consensus really is that a lot of what would be found in this treated water is not likely to be harmful to people. There are things that we don't know about in these tanks that maybe behave in the marine environment in ways that may be unexpected. But by and large, the general consensus from the international scientific community is that if appropriate procedures are followed, there's not likely to be immediate danger to human health, but that these societal aspects are a much bigger concern. And indeed, as I said, Japanese fishers have strongly opposed this release, which they've claimed is going to be catastrophic, this release of Fukushima water into the ocean. And I wanted to flag up a map just to show why this is. I took great satisfaction making this. I'm a geographer by training. I have a PhD in geography, and I always like to make a map. So each of these red dots represents a coastal fishing port. The yellow dot in the middle there is the Fukushima nuclear plant. Each of these red dots is a small cooperative-run coastal fishing port. And it's maybe been apparent through some of the slides I've shown, but generally coastal fisheries are run on quite a small basis. So where I'm from in Scotland, we tend to have massive trawlers that go out for weeks on end, and the captains make millions of pounds a year, and they do huge damage to the ecosystem. A lot of the boats in Fukushima are different. They're smaller, they have smaller crews, they're run on a cooperative basis. Captains and crew don't make huge profits. It's a matter of livelihood for them. And so you have here a not insignificant number of small fishing ports, many of which have actually only just opened within the last year and a half, following the rehabilitation of tsunami and radiation effects. And so if you're releasing tainted water, or water perceived as tainted from the nuclear plant, that's got a potential to affect fishing activities in a huge number of small ports. And the fishers themselves are very aware of the fact that fish, radiation, ocean currents don't respect geographical boundaries. So if a fish is swimming outside the nuclear plant, it could swim north, south, it could cover quite a significant distance. So there's a lot of concern over what, the perception that this might have on Fukushima produce. And as I said before, this is the geographically kind of delineated area of Fukushima. And by name association, any port here becomes associated with the nuclear plant and with radiation. So again, is it some of the more recent work? We've talked with fisheries extension officers, with consumers, indeed, with fishers, as I said before, to understand what some of these concerns specifically are about what's at stake with the releases of treated water. And it circles back to exactly the same things that I was talking about earlier, that it's not just an economic or scientific issue. It's got the potential to affect livelihoods and indeed the kind of inherent resilience of coastal communities. So one question that gets asked quite a lot is, could you not just compensate the fishers? And the fact that this has been happening anyway since the nuclear accident. So Tokyo Electric Power Company, who operates the Fukushima Daiichi plant, they were bankrupted by the accident. They were nationalized essentially as a result. And so more or less through the Japanese taxpayer, fishers receive compensation payments, which are, I don't want to say generous, but it's fair to say that the compensation payments cover what would be expected to be a reasonable income from fishing. But that doesn't give fishers their livelihoods back. It doesn't give coastal communities the sense of pride and sense of identity that comes from having a healthy, functioning marine ecosystem where fish are being landed and consumed that people feel they can take pride in. And this is why I think the fisheries cooperatives have very strongly expressed this view that releasing treated water into the sea would reset the revitalization efforts, and a lot of these practices back to zero. It has quite a profound and extensive effect on the social and cultural landscape, as well as on the socioeconomics. There's also, I just want to flag this up briefly too, because I'm aware I've been talking for quite a while, that the situation at the plant itself is just one change among many in the sea and on the coast of Fukushima. So another thing that younger fishers especially talked about a lot was climate change. And the fishers are now, they're seeing different fish coming into their nets. They're sensing through changes in catches that they're picking up different species. They're picking up species that are normally associated with warmer currents further south. As I said, younger fishers especially are becoming aware of overfishing. And so there were some fishers who'd maybe only been working for 1 or 2 years. Then because of the disaster, they had to stop. Then they returned to fishing a few years later. And they were saying, we were absolutely stunned by how many fish we were bringing in our nets. They said, because there had been no fishing happening, the fish stocks had been able to replenish quite significantly. And the result of this was it made sort of especially younger fishers be quite aware that the extent of fishing they were doing was having a pretty harmful effect on the marine environment. And it didn't stop them fishing, but it made them think. And also as well, there's all these other issues around renewable energy deployment. So there's offshore wind turbines both on the coast and in the sea. And one can think about, well, where is that electricity going? Which parts of the Japanese grid are benefiting from that? So again, that's just to highlight that the situation at the Fukushima nuclear plant is very significant, but it is only one of a number of drivers of change in the coastal and marine environment. This is again something that's happened locally. And it's interesting that a number of citizens of Fukushima are taking matters into their own hands on Twitter. Because this is very recent and live, I've taken the liberty for ethical reasons of blanking out the names and handles of those involved. But there's been this big thread and big trend of people who live and work in Fukushima prefecture saying that they will continue to eat Fukushima fish even after treated water has been released into the sea. And you'll see nearly all of them say the same thing here. Tabemasu ne, it means yes, I'll eat it. Tabemasu, and yeah, I'll eat it. Nearly everybody there says this. Yep, I'm going to continue to eat the fish. I'm going to continue to eat the fish even after treated water has been released. And this thread went on a big, huge, long channel of people saying that. And I just want to finish with this last point here. And I apologize that I am showing you my feet in the middle of the day, Texas time, but I get asked this a lot by my students who often ask me if I think that the sea and water of Fukushima is safe. And the answer is that based on the science, based on the interactions, by and large, I think I do. And so I took a dip in the sea last time I was there. The bathing beaches opened in January. It was quite cold. I don't recommend it. When I go to Fukushima, I do eat local seafood, I eat local produce. But on a personal note, as I'd said before, I think it's important to respect that individuals will make decisions about consumption based on their own values, on their own life experiences, and that just because I personally choose to do this during my fieldwork does not mean that everybody ought to do this. And that, as I say, that the decisions people make are based on people's own worldviews, value systems and value judgments and senses of trust, and that hitting people over the head with the science repeatedly is not an appropriate strategy, in my view, to bring folk on side. So I just wanted to flag up to finish a couple of things that I've done recently. So one thing I've produced is a short explainer on the current situation at Fukushima Daiichi. And I think it's very hard to get accurate but also nuanced information through the noise and the internet. So I produced a short explainer synthesizing some of the science and also some of the social science and ethics, which is on my blog. And I also made for my students a virtual field trip using Google Street View and a series of YouTube clips and things that I've hauled together. And I don't know who's in the audience today, but if anybody wants to use these for teaching, you are more than welcome to. They're online and I'm happy to make these publicly available. So just in summary, to finish, rehabilitation of the coastal landscape and the restarts of fisheries, I think, are key to sustaining this idea of resilience from the bottom up at the community level on the Fukushima coast. And as I just said, citizens' decisions to consume seafood are based not only on risk perception, but also on issues of pride, identity, and sense of belonging. And also, on the other hand on questions of trust and personal views on what constitutes an acceptable level of risk and uncertainty. Treated water releases, even if they are proven to be safe in inverted commas, hence have got the potential to, to jeopardize the already slow recovery of fisheries. And I apologize for the grammatical error at the end of that sentence. And also these debates over managing treated water come against a much bigger and increasingly noticeable backdrop of climate change effects on coastal communities. So I will stop there. Thanks very much for your attention and bearing with me. I will stop sharing my screen there, and I'll be very happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mabon. That was fascinating to hear about the current situation, to hear about the history, putting that into context, and the incredible richness of the research that you've been doing there with your colleagues for many years now. I feel like we can have many questions to ask you, but I also appreciate the way in which you were able to discuss some tragic circumstances, very different ones from some of the fishing communities that we've been learning about during the rest of the series. But certainly points of intersection in terms of community building, for example, and of course resilience. So really a wonderful talk. So the way we're going to do questions, I'm the chair, and I'm not going to go into reasons for this, but if you could go to your reactions, and if you have a question, if you could use the thumbs up symbol, please. And then I'll call on you, and we'll do it in that kind of order. And you can unmute yourself when I call on you. So that's how we're going to do questions. So yeah, so please use the thumbs up reaction if you have a question, and we'll go from there. Noah Leisure.
Yes, certainly, yes, ma'am. And I'm sorry, Dr. Les, I don't know if you mentioned this earlier. When exactly did the contamination leak happen? Like the exact date?
The exact date, and so the contamination had started with the hydrogen explosions, which would have been 2 or 3 days after the tsunami hit. So probably around March 13th or 14th. As I said, what happened then was that you had because of the loss of cooling systems, you had a buildup of hydrogen in the reactors, which led to explosions, which spewed harmful material out over land and sea. So that's when it started. The wind changed direction, and that took some contamination over land, some out to sea. And so that was probably the most harmful material came out immediately after. Also, when you then had the meltdowns, you had highly contaminated water from the mixing of I suppose, floodwater and groundwater out from the plant into the sea. So that was probably in a month or thereabouts, over the first month or so. That's when the most harmful, the most vigorous radiation was released into the marine environment, probably within the first month or so. Subsequently, there were also releases of less highly concentrated radioactive matter in the months that followed, as they tried to bring the damaged reactors under control.
I'm about to say, with COVID and everything, I'm sure once it happened, it's not only the contamination leak, but it's also, stopping further leaking from happening. So that was my other question.
That's exactly it. And then a lot of these leaks then continued for a few years of, there was still material, not at highly harmful levels, but nonetheless leaks did still happen from the plant into the groundwater and then out into the sea. And so they built an ice wall, which sounds crazy, but they actually did this. A wall they essentially froze the ground to stop tainted groundwater getting into the sea. this happened around, I don't remember the exact date, but around 2015, 2016. This was followed by efforts to pump up contaminated groundwater back up to the ground and store it in tanks. So the vast majority of the leakage stopped around about 15, 16. This is why the releases of treated water now are proving quite controversial.
And the whole thing happened on 2014. Do I have my dates
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So
Okay.
absolutely, yeah.
March 13th. Okay, just want to double check on that. Appreciate it. And one other question I'm asking, Dr. Leslie, just curiosity, more personal. I know you have from Scottish descent. Super jealous of that, by the way. Why do you focus your efforts on another country? If you don't mind me, I think that's very noble of you to do. But if you don't mind me asking, why do you focus all your efforts on another country?
Okay, there's two reasons for that. There's a personal reason and there's a professional reason.
If you don't mind me asking.
No, absolutely not at all. Because it's an entirely relevant question. So the personal reason is that my wife is Japanese. So my wife is from the south of Japan. She's from quite far away from Fukushima. And so it was clearly quite a shocking and traumatic thing. We were living apart before we got married when the accident happened. So I was watching all of this remotely from Scotland in real time and was quite kind of shocked by it. I think what I found quite particularly distressing was that, you know, I grew up myself in a fishing village in northeast Scotland.
Yeah, I mentioned that. Yeah.
And even though fishing has really declined, where I grew up, there's very, very little fishing now. But nonetheless, you know, I know how significant fishing still is to local identity. You know, how much we see it in the built environment, how much we see it in the landscape every day. You know, it kind of made me think, well, you know, what if this had happened where I live? And, you know, it affected me quite profoundly. I'd also, around that time, been doing research into new energy infrastructure and controversy over risk in the Scottish marine environment. So from a professional point of view, I kind of thought, well, I've got the language skill and I've got some of the contextual knowledge of Japan. And I also have the sort of conceptual and theoretical knowledge of the marine environment, risk and social science, critical social science perspectives on risk. Can we apply those in a Japanese context? And so that's how it came about. There was the personal factor, and there was also the professional interest in thinking about how I can maybe apply some of the conceptual approaches to local context, to Japanese context as well. And I think just one thing I'll just tack on very quickly at the end of that as well is that I kind of grapple a lot with trying to avoid what's known as parachute research. And, you know, I'm aware I'm a relatively well-off, white, educated man, and if you set the family ties aside, I don't want to kind of be seen to be appearing on the Fukushima coast and extracting a lot of data and disappearing again. So I've always tried to sort of work in partnership with and be led by my colleagues like Kawabe Sensei, who have the local context and access and knowledge, and to try and bear that in mind and respect that when it comes to research design and writing up and publication. So thanks very much. That's a really good question. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share that.
No, thank you for your time, Dr. Les. That's cool. Good luck on your future research.
We have some other questions. James Howell has a question.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. And I had a question about, and I realize that this is not the focus of your research, but I'm just wondering if it's something that you've kept an eye on while you've been working on these issues, is the international reaction to the decision to start to release some of this water into the ocean. And I know that Fukushima, because of where it is in Japan, it's not directly adjacent to any other country. You know, if it had been potentially on the west coast of Japan, you know, there might have been a stronger reaction from, you know, the Koreas or Russia or what have you. But so I know that there aren't any immediate neighbors in that area, but I'm just curious if there's been if you've registered sort of the overall attitude to this decision. I ask because, you know, I'm a German scholar. I study contemporary Germany and climate change and things like that. And I know that every time, you know, Belgium decides to open up, you know, a nuclear power plant, the Germans living not that far away, you know, there's usually quite an uproar. And so I'm just wondering, you know, how all of this fits in with the larger international global conversation, if that's something that you've kept an eye on as well.
That's a great question. And in fact, I've actually set one of my students working on this for his final year project for this year. So if you ask me again in 6 months' time, I'll hopefully have a much more rich answer. Nonetheless, the parallels with Germany and Belgium are quite interesting, because although the release is on the east side of Japan, the strongest and most vocal opposition has come from Korea. And there are clear and very obvious historical tensions. And a lot of the opposition from the Korean context needs to be considered in relation to the history between the two countries, which is not entirely from the Japanese side, is quite an unpleasant history that hasn't been acknowledged to the extent it perhaps should have. So a lot of there's a very strong critical response from Korea and also from Taiwan. So Fukushima produce is still banned in Taiwan. The political relations between Taiwan and Japan are not as adversarial as between Korea and Japan, but nonetheless they are still there. So anytime there is an issue around releases of treated material from the Fukushima plant, it flares up these geopolitical tensions. It's also, interestingly, there is an interesting reaction that's coming Canada. So Canada being on the other side of the Pacific, and I have a friend, Jay Cullen, who works at the University of Victoria, and he's a marine chemist. And so he's been running a project for the last few years, and he's been tracking Fukushima radionuclides. Essentially, he's been asking communities along the coast of British Columbia to go out and take water samples and send them to his lab, and he and his students then process them, partly to, you know, as a kind of public reassurance measure to reassure citizens that anything that's found is not going to be anywhere near levels to be harmful to British Columbia salmon, but also just as a science experiment to show how ocean currents work. And Jay has received horrific abuse for doing this on social media. It actually got really nasty and out of hand to the extent that people were sending him death threats, and you know, it ended up in a court case where somebody was prosecuted for threatening to kill him and his family for essentially claiming that he was a government shill that was covering up the severity of the Fukushima accident. So there's a very kind of not at a kind of national geopolitical level, but there's also a kind of very nasty undercurrent internationally, which has been directed at scientists who have been studying the marine implications of the Fukushima accident. And thankfully, I've managed to keep out of this, mainly because I ignore or mute trolls. Jay engages with them, and it's very noble of him to do so. He engages with people on the science and discusses and debates with them. But this is one of the strange side effects, is that kind of anti-government conspiracy theorist community that's one of the darker parts of the internet, internationally has also latched onto and attacked some of the scientists who are working on this issue internationally. So that's a very long answer to what is a very good and very interesting question.
Well, thank you very much.
We have a question from Denise.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was wondering, obviously the releases won't stay in the Japanese, in the Japanese coastal waters. They will travel out and around. And so I'm wondering, do you remember where all the debris ended up? I remember it took, I think, a few years to get around, but if you could talk about the large, pieces of debris and even the smaller debris that went to other places. And also if you could talk about sea vegetables and seaweed and what kind of studies have been done on that. If you could talk about that. And also, I was living in Hawaii at the time when it happened, and there were a lot of lies being told about the releases, and people were getting, different people that actually had air monitors were seeing different numbers than we were being told. And not just in Hawaii, but I believe also on the west coast of the United States, the mainland. So if you could just kind of talk about these issues. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Firstly, as far as debris is concerned, it's some of it travelled very far. And I know there have been cases, things have been washed up in British Columbia, things have been washed up, I think, in Alaska, all down the western seaboard of the United States. Fishing boats and things have turned up. A lot of things have turned up. Larger pieces of debris. A lot of things have sunk in the seabed. One thing that has happened is actually a lot of debris ended up not going very far, and particularly household objects. So the tsunami swept in, demolished a lot of buildings, but then it was carried back out. And there's one township, Namie, which is in the northern half of Fukushima, and the construction company that's been tasked with rehabilitating the soil and rebuilding settlements and infrastructure and roads, they've set up a walk-in centre whereby when they do the excavations, they're finding a huge amount of things, family objects from the surrounding area. Things like family photos, wedding rings, tombstones, children's toys, soft toys, school uniforms, musical instruments. And as a kind of corporate social responsibility initiative, this construction company have taken it upon themselves to, anything they find, anything at all, they will note where they found it, where they think it may have come from, they'll clean it up. And the hope is that over time, people who may have lost things or who may have lost family members, who have lost objects, can come in and can reclaim things that may have been theirs in the past. And it's quite a very, I would say personally, it was the most moving thing that I've ever seen in the time I've been doing field work in Fukushima. It's just these household objects. So to answer that bit of the question, some large things were carried very far, but a lot of smaller pieces of everyday life didn't actually get that far and are still being turned up now. As regards the seabed, so sea sediments and seaweeds and sea vegetables are monitored. They take sediment surveys off boats and through diving. So sediment surveys are taken as well as surveys from the water itself. Seaweed is consumed a lot in Japan, although it's not grown commercially in any of the areas, as to the best of my knowledge, within Fukushima. If you go a bit further north, there is commercial cultivation of seaweed. It's not grown commercially, or at least consumed commercially, on the Fukushima coast. But nonetheless, it is a concern, because things that either live and grow on the seabed or at the greater depths, that's where the radioactive matter is consumed. And also, whilst commercial fishing is not allowed, there's also an issue then about, well, if people catch fish or harvest things for their own personal consumption, that's up to them. If they wish to take the risk, they can do so. If they wish to have it screened, they can. But there's commercial cultivation versus what people are doing personally. And the last bit of that as well was about, I think, about different information and false information and things that are going round. And again, this I think comes back to the previous question from James Howell as well. And that is about making this distinction between what is fake news versus what are legitimate concerns that people might have based on their own interpretations of uncertainty. So the things around the air monitors are interesting as well, because you can get very radically different readings depending on where you are in certain spaces of time, depending on the local environment. So I don't know about Hawaii, but I used to live in Aberdeen, Scotland, where all houses are built of granite. And so the radiation, the ambient radiation in Aberdeen, because of granite, is higher than it is on the Fukushima coast because of residual radiation. So it is interesting, and you see some of these videos floating about on YouTube, and there was a particularly unpleasant documentary on Netflix, Dark Tourist, where they sort of stage managed this visit to the Fukushima exclusion zone, and they had these Geiger counters. So again, how people interpret the readings of those varies depending on what people are trying to kind of prove. There are, interestingly, independent monitoring initiatives. So I talked about one there, the Umi Labo fishing initiative. There's also SafeCast, which is an American NGO, which American/Japanese NGO, which is committed to citizen science for radiation monitoring, who have got monitoring stations set up operating in real time in Fukushima. So it's really difficult. And I mean, the only thing I can say is similar as I said in the talk. It's absolutely vital that you don't dismiss everything as fake news, that one doesn't dismiss everything as fake news, but that there is clearly this difference between wild speculation versus legitimate interpretations and different perspectives. So that hopefully, I hope that answers what are some really
well,
good
I'm just when people are trying to take readings and understand, how dangerous is it? If we're trying to understand, is it safe to eat seaweed? Is it safe to, breathe the air in a certain time? Is it safe to swim in the ocean in a certain place? What exactly are we looking at? You mentioned, you started earlier like titanium or tritium or something. Can you talk about, what are the things that people are measuring and how are they measuring them?
Yep, certainly. And that indeed's a big issue. So we did a discussion group not long after the accident with fishers, and the fishers were saying, the scientists from the regional government will come to us with readings, and they'll say, but we don't know what these readings mean. We've learned that a certain number means safe, a certain number means dangerous, but well, not dangerous, but unsafe for consumption, unsuitable for consumption, but we don't know what these mean. And it's a real challenge. So broadly speaking, when it comes to fish, what is measured for is radioactive cesium. So an element that is being produced as a result of the Fukushima meltdowns that is absorbed by the flesh and matter of fish. And what's measured is the sort of concentration or the sort of level of radioactivity per kilogram of that in the different marine species. And so understanding how fish take that up and which bits of the fish store those harmful substances the most is really important. But also, and that's what I kind of alluded to in the slide at the end from Ken Busler, is that there are different elements as well that have the potential to emit ionizing radiation. Different elements like tritium. Some of these don't live very long in the natural environments. They're not a cause for concern. Others live a bit longer. And it's understanding, well, what are the ones that live the longest? What are the ones that have the potential to be harmful to people? And where do they exist? In the air, it's a different thing again, because what's measured is not the sort of vigor of radiation in a kind of solid lump of fish, but it's the exposure that you're getting from the ambient environment. That uses a different set of indicators by and large. They use sieverts, which is essentially the kind of knows how much radioactivity you can be expected to be exposed to by just being in that environment for a specific period of time. And I agree with you completely. It's very challenging and it's really hard because it's asking a lot of people cognitively to understand what it is that's being measured. So to go back to what I said at the start of the answer, the regional government has engaged with fishers and they've talked about, well, what is safe in inverted commas versus what is not suitable yet for consumption. But then there's a lot of work to be done, and it is asking a lot of people to understand, well, what do those numbers mean? And so this is why, again, I'm going to come to the end of my answer in just a second, but this is why this NGO, the Umilabo group, have set up these events where they talk people through the whole process of dissecting a fish, putting it into a mass spectrometer, looking at the graphs that come out, and the idea being to talk the public through this process and to understand, well, what does it actually mean to say that cesium is not detected? What does that mean when we get that reading? What are the grounds on which we are making these claims? What is the process through which this happens? So I'm learning this stuff too, because my background's in human geography and sociology. So I've been learning a lot over the last few years. And so I'm still learning myself, and I hope that's a satisfactory answer to, again, what was a very good question.
Did you say that?
Sorry, could I sorry, we're getting close to finishing. I'm sorry, Denise, I just had to.
Can you just clarify the name of is it Safecast? What did he say that was group was called?
That's right, yeah, Safecast, SAFECAST.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Denise, for those questions. I would just wanted to make sure before we finish, if there are others who have maybe one last quick question. Just looking to see if anybody's raised their hand or done their thumbs up. Well, as far as I can tell, I think questions have been answered. So let me just, I have my own question, but I don't want to keep people. I know we're already at 2:30. So let me just thank you so much, Dr. Mabon, for a rich talk. It's incredible to hear your expertise and the expertise that your colleagues in this research have gathered. And I think we look forward to finding out more as the research continues, because it's a very sad, very tragic accident, but it's wonderful to see the kind of resilience that that the local communities are really experiencing in terms of some kind of bouncing back. But thank you again, and everyone. Let's just clap our hands.
Thank you all as well for your attention and your great question. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.